using video games to facilitate understanding of Attention Deficit Hyperactivity Disorder. It's my master's work that I completed at Drexel University in Philadelphia, PA, under advisement of Jichen, frankly, also of Drexel, and Jenny Starosa, who is an outside child psychologist. Sorry. So just a quick overview. The goal is to study how video games can help to facilitate understanding of ADHD. To do this, we developed a video game called Drawn to Distraction, which was designed to simulate the feeling of ADHD through the game mechanics themselves, rather than using information, text, things like that. We also conducted a few pilot studies, and we acquired feasibility data for future work. So the concept sort of begins with the idea of the internal perspective affecting your behavior. So if you can understand that internal psychological perspective of someone else, you can ideally understand their behavior. We can all get along better. So the reason we would focus on ADHD is there was a need in the field expressed to me by Dr. Starosta. She deals with children and parents all the time, parents that can't understand why their child can't follow a request, even if they're trying to work on this with a psychologist. ADHD is also highly controversial, yet scientifically backed. It's widely diagnosed, and the figure I have here is 48% of school-age children. That's in the US. It's a little bit lower in Europe and other areas, but it still is a widely diagnosed disorder. And research also led us to sort of this dysfunctional cycle. So the lack of understanding leads to greater caregiver stress. Caregiver stress has been linked to negative parental practices, sometimes not even attempting more positive practices due to low perceived efficacy. Then negative parental practices are, of course, linked to underachievement. Underachievement in children, underachievement goes back into why is my child not succeeding? So it's a cycle that we would try to hope to break with new techniques and maybe video games. Sorry about that. Okay, let's go back here. The design of our game sort of started with ADHD research itself. So we looked into some of Russell Barkley's work, one of the leading researchers, practitioners, and we narrowed it down to one message that we wanted to inform our whole game design. So, and that is that ADHD-affected individuals are drawn toward immediately rewarding yet ultimately harmful choices. So with the game, we wanted its processes to mimic the processes of ADHD in the mind. So therefore, using this message, the game mechanics should also draw players to make immediately rewarding yet harmful choices. So just to explain that, you would want to play instead of doing your homework, because playing has a reward now, whereas doing your homework has might possibly a greater reward later. Actually, the hardest part of this project is trying to make a video you can see on a projector, but in the game, you play as a child trying to get to the library in time for a test. You're moving through this linear but winding hallway. Meanwhile, these thought bubbles appear in front of the screen that sort of mentioned a game within the game called Space Raiders. Your thoughts manifest real as these spaceships, these colorful spaceships that appear in the environment. And when you touch them, you actually go into the game within the game, and that's technically the distraction. So this is Space Raiders. It's a very simple game. You just move your spaceship up and down, you shoot asteroids, you try to get a high score. What you may not notice is that the time actually ticks by 10 times as fast in this game to sort of simulate losing track of time during a distraction. And as time ticks down, you'll see more and more thoughts appearing, more and more thought objects appearing. So that never really becomes a challenge because that wasn't something we wanted to design, but it becomes more intense over time. And then if you don't make it in time, you fail your test. If you make it, you succeed. Fix this. Okay, so as far as the design of the game, everything was very intentional. We have an introduction that tells you you can make it if you don't get distracted. So the player knows that if they touch one of these objects, they could potentially fail. You have a timer. Also, we don't just have the player fail randomly. We want it to be because of a choice. So they can see the time that they have left and decide if they want to be distracted or not. The player moves very slowly. He might have looked like he was moonwalking to you if you could see that on the projector. That's very intentional. We want the player to almost be annoyed by how slow you move. Also, the very bland environment. Everything is gray. There's just lockers on the wall. You're not really going to want to explore in this environment. And ultimately, the main goal of the game, so to win the game, it's a very unstimulating task. So you have to actually move through the winding hallway while avoiding the distractions, which isn't, as I said, isn't very challenging, for about 6 or 7 minutes, which isn't very fun. So it's an unstimulating main goal intentionally. Meanwhile, the spaceships that manifest in the environment and the moving thoughts are sort of designed, are the only really interesting objects to try to drive you toward doing something you're not supposed to do. Meanwhile, Space Raiders is very easy to play. It gives the player the goal to get the high score. It's not really something that takes much time to learn. You just move up and down and shoot lasers at asteroids. So the distraction was sort of designed to suck you in and keep you there. So the goals of our study were to acquire quantitative and qualitative feasibility data for potential future work. What we did was we recorded any potential understanding changes using pre and post questionnaires that we designed, and we also wanted to determine game mechanic effectiveness. So we gave them a pre-questionnaire, and then we had them play the game once, and then we gave them a post-questionnaire. Just an example of some of the questions. In your opinion, how aware are ADHD-diagnosed individuals in terms of how ADHD affects their actions? How well do you feel you understand the effects that ADHD has on an individual? And they answered on a 1 to 7 numeric scale. There were 6 questions in the first 2 studies. First 2 studies, we originally intended to mostly use caregivers, but logistical reasons kind of prevented that. So study 1 had we recruited 7 caregivers, mostly female. Only 1 had actually had a lot of video game experience. The rest had next to none. Study 2 was students from Drexel, mostly male. Most of them played games regularly and had a friend or family member with ADHD, so they were familiar. Interestingly, both groups said that ADHD was a disorder of focus beforehand, and most believed that ADHD was valid. So the results of study 1, no significant change or no statistically significant change. Lack of video game experience with the caregivers seemed to be an issue, and only 1 participant actually reached the successful outcome, and that was the one with the most video game experience. So we sort of had the idea that players of this version of the game may need more familiarity with video games. However, in student 2, there was also no statistically significant change, and that was with people with more experience. However, qualitative results were very positive. So students liked the concept, they understood the game's intent, and when we asked what sort of message do you think this game is trying to express, they expressed the exact message that we had designed into the game. So there was something good there. Interesting from this study was that the distractions were less appealing to more experienced game players, so what we were trying to drive them toward, because of the heavy-handed techniques that we may have been using, it was actually pushing them away. So that sort of shows the fine line in design. How do you push certain people towards something when you're actually pushing other people away from it? So we revised our study to do a 3rd quick round because we had a feeling, because of the strong qualitative results, that the questions were probably not designed properly because we designed them on our own. So we refocused all of our questions entirely on the design message that we had intended. Questions such as, I understand what it feels like to be affected by ADHD, I understand the frustration that can be felt by those with ADHD, and I understand the impact of ADHD on time management skills. So these are also simpler to read. We felt that these would be better questions, and we wanted to test them out. So we had another small group of 8 students, all male, video game experienced. We went through the same process just with new questions. So we did get, some statistically significant changes in those 3 questions that I read before, and those are empathy-related questions. So we found that to mean that our revisions may have potentially been valid. I didn't mention this, but we also added telemetry data, so recording how long people spent in the hallway, how long they spent in the distraction game, and we wanted to ask how long they felt they spent doing these things, and to sort of see if there was anything there. But we would get things like I thought I spent 4 minutes running in the hallway, or it was really 3 minutes and 20 seconds. So it was not really in the scope of this to sort of judge whether that was significant or not because of how human beings judge time. So it was mostly inconclusive. So overall, we got inconclusive quantitative results in the first 2 studies, but we had improved quantitative results when we revised our questionnaires. We had useful qualitative results to be used for future work through observations, responses, and comments from all of our participants. Video game experience seemed to be a huge factor, both on the high end and the low end. Ultimately, for these feasibility studies, our results were inconclusive because of our low sample size, and that was mostly due to limitations. For recruiting caregivers, something as simple as a rainstorm could sort of take away your entire recruiting day because people didn't want to walk to where you're doing the test. So we faced some logistical issues there. Also, due to time issues, we weren't able to test our game with caregivers throughout the development process, which is something you absolutely have to do, but we just weren't able to. And then we faced the issues of usability. Also, most participants saying that they understood the attention portion of ADHD, the attention deficiency portion, beforehand, and then we ended up focusing on that as part of our game design message was a problem because everybody already understood that part. And also our custom questionnaires. In the future, we may want to use a more proven empathy-based instrument to rather than things that we designed ourselves. So basically, for future work, plan on developing usability of your product first and then judging understanding, because you don't want a barrier there. And plan for lots of testing with your specific audiences, whether it's caregivers that may not have much experience or experienced video game experienced hardcore gamers, so to speak. And then, of course, you could bring this to other psychological disorders. Basically, the technique is looking into disorder research and then trying to transfer that into game mechanics that treat the player the same way that the disorder is theoretically treating someone with a disorder. Something that also would be interesting to test is using more abstract game environments. So we used sort of a realistic environment, and maybe is it the realistic environment that is getting someone to get the message, or could you do that with geometric shapes or some other sort of game like that? So that's all I have, kind of an overview, but so if you have any more questions, just let me know. Thanks.